and today is the first of that series, and we're going to be looking at resilience and what it means as a government. We have a credible cast and crew that have joined us for this call. First of all, and I'm not thanking them in advance, but I'd like to welcome the Dr. Joe Abba to this call. He'll be acting as the moderator and also a co-panelist. For all those that don't know, Dr. Abba was the former head of the Bureau for Public Sector Reform, and he's currently the country director of DAI. The lead faculty, because it's a faculty, the lead for this call will be the team from Ernst & Young. I will ask them to introduce themselves. This is not too much introduction. I want us to go into the call immediately because we just have about an hour, 90 minutes for this call. It's going to be a conversation. For those that are on the line already, I'd like you to please share your comments, your thoughts, your questions on the question tool, which is at the bottom of this screen. And we'd also like you to share knowledge as well, because I know that a lot of parastatals are already putting strategies in place for resilience and business continuity. So please, let's use this as, let's start the conversation. What do we need to start doing? What does resilience look for us in the public sector? And what can we take forward from the learning that Ernst & Young and Dr. Abba will be sharing with us this evening. So with that and without further ado, I'd like to hand over the call to the moderator for this evening, Dr. Joe Abba. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Commissioner. I don't know who's on the call, so I'll just go through a protocol list. Your Excellency, the Governor of Lagos State, Your Excellency, the Deputy Governor of Lagos State, the Secretary to the State Government of Lagos State, the Head of the Civil Service of Lagos State, Honorable Commissioners here present, particularly our host, the Honorable Commissioner for Establishment, Training and Pensions, Permanent Secretaries of the Lagos State Government, Managing Directors, Directors General, Executive Secretaries of government parastatals, departments, and agencies. You're very welcome to this webinar. I'm pleased that you were able to join us. I'll go straight into the discussions. And that is to start by saying that Lagos State is currently in the middle of a major crisis occasioned by the global COVID-19 pandemic actually. And the ability of the government to respond with urgency and to respond robustly and optimally will have a long-lasting effect on the fortunes of Lagos State, both now and in the future. And so this is a very timely discussion to have, and that's why the Honorable Commissioner for Staff, Training and Pensions has convened this very important gathering of highly experienced people. I worked in number 10 Downing Street during the 9/11 terrorist attack. And one of the things we said, one of our mantras then, was you should never waste a good crisis. It may sound a bit funny to think of a crisis as a good thing, but a crisis can often provide an opportunity for self-reflection. It can provide an opportunity to forge new ways of doing things. And I was working in the federal government during the Ebola crisis as well. And I noticed some of the reasons for our success in managing that crisis. And that included cross-party collaboration between the federal government and the state governments, carrying everybody along, the media, the civil society organizations, the community-based groups, everybody banded together to defeat what was an existential threat. And of course, as a governance professional, I've often wondered if we're able to tackle Ebola so robustly, what have we learned that we can use to tackle corruption, that we can use to tackle power deficiency in the country? And so this crisis presents us with yet another opportunity to think about how to do things differently. But that raises a number of questions in our minds. And so about 2 weeks ago, the Lagos State government announced that officers of level 12 and below should essentially stay at home to enable better social distancing. But what does that mean for their productivity? How can they continue to contribute and deliver public goods to the citizens of Lagos State? That is something we must apply our minds to. What about those on level 4 and above? Do they have the tools with which to work remotely, given the recent blanket shutdown that the president announced a couple of days or so ago? How feasible is remote working in the Lagos State government that we currently have? And what do we need to do to make it more feasible, given the usual leanness of resources that exist? These are the sorts of questions that must continue to task our minds. As I said, we've had the 9/11 crisis, which perhaps didn't affect us directly, but we had the Ebola crisis. Now we have this COVID-19 pandemic. There will be another crisis in future. It is not a cause, it's just the normal way of things. How prepared is the Lagos State government for a future crisis? It may not be a pandemic, it may not be a health crisis, but it could be another sort of crisis. How prepared is the Lagos State government to handle disruptions and future crises? What is the continuity plan of the government? How can the government continue to deliver public goods to the people of Lagos State? This particular crisis has required the Lagos State government to move quickly through the normal processes and procedures for doing things to ensure that it protects its people and the people of Nigeria in general. What have we learned by so doing? So are there aspects of the way we do things that we have had to modify and adjust during this crisis, but that may be useful for us to think about going forward? And my mind goes to issues such as the Public Procurement Act, in the public procurement law in Lagos State. Are there aspects of it that we can look at to make ourselves a bit more nimble when we're faced with these kinds of crises? What about our financial regulations? Do we have to approve every single thing on paper? Or can we use tools such as DocuSign or other ways in which we can process approvals electronically? What about authorities that we delegate? Can we look again at our schedule of authorities and see whether we can delegate certain authorities to certain people for us to be able to act quickly, nimbly, and responsively whenever we need to? This crisis will hit the economy of Lagos hard. The economy of Lagos is the 5th largest in Africa. And this crisis will hit it quite hard, because when you shut down an economy the size of that of Lagos, it has a profound effect, not just on Lagos State alone, but also on Nigeria as a country. And that means we need to look at two things side by side. The first is, how can we reduce costs, and how can we manage and better control and eliminate waste? So how do we control costs, keep costs under control, without, of course, causing undue hardship to people and without constraining operations? And how do we eliminate waste? If you look at government expenditure, some of the biggest items of expenditure are travel, training, particularly in fancy hotels, duty tour allowances and things like that. We have had to continue working during this crisis without being able to meet in hotels, without being able to travel. Are there things that we can do going forward, even after this crisis, that means we can start to reduce expenditure on some of those cost items? what about growing our revenue? Are there things we can do to grow our revenue? Can we sell the expertise with which Lagos has managed the Ebola crisis, with which Lagos is also managing this COVID-19 crisis, to others to teach them how to respond to crisis for a fee, of course? So do we have expertise that we can sell? How do we communicate to our people? How do we engage with our people, given that in times like this, we can no longer do town hall meetings, which Lagos has been at the forefront of doing for a long time? How do we communicate with our people? How do we keep our stakeholders engaged despite the restrictions of movement? And going forward, do we whenever we get back to being able to do town hall meetings again, how do we incorporate these virtual engagements into our strategy to ensure that we're engaging with our people through multiple means? Finally, what are we doing during this crisis that it may be beneficial for us to continue doing even after the crisis has ended? There are many other questions, I'm sure, which are exercising your mind. So please send in those questions during the question and answer session. There's also a survey, which the Honorable Commissioner has already announced, which seeks your views on some of these issues that I've talked about and a few other issues. Our colleagues from Ernst & Young have addressed a number of these issues that I've raised in their organizations. And I'll now invite them to share their experience and expertise in handling some of these issues so that you can see that some of these things are actually possible to do, and then to see how we can relate that experience to the realities of working in the public sector. And don't worry, I am in the private sector now, but I was a public servant in Nigeria for 4 years as the Director General, and a public servant and a senior civil servant in the UK for 15 years. So I feel your pain, and I know where all the bodies are buried. I'll now invite Ernst & Young to give their presentation before we go to the next phase of the discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abba. That was quite an introduction. I'd like to start by introducing my team. Please allow me to stand on existing protocol in the essence of time. We would like to go straight into the presentation. On the call with me today are 3 of my colleagues. First, there is Mr. Ben Afudego. Ben Afudego is our head of advisory, pretty much leading our management consulting practice. There is also myself, Bumi Kuku. I'm the partner in charge of performance improvement and also the coordinating partner on the Lagos State account. I also have my colleague, Dr. Benson Iweru, who is our risk advisory partner, as well as Miss Lola Esson, who leads a people advisory practice. She's a director within the PAS practice. I'd like to hand over very quickly to Lola, but before I do that, I'd like to speak about some things which pretty much represent what we all are going through now. So not just as a government, but really around the citizens as well. It's probably been about 3 months where we've been hearing around what's happening globally on COVID. We didn't take it as significant as we should have in the last 3 months, probably because we thought we were shielded to an extent. And in the last 3 weeks, we've all of a sudden been running around trying to figure out what to do relative to making sure that from a safety perspective, people are well, from a business continuity perspective, hence the reason why we're having this session today. Lagos in particular has become a hotbed for the COVID-19, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And we would expect that to be the case, obviously, given the population size of Lagos, the impact that Lagos as a city has to play from an economic perspective. And there are probably a few areas that we would like to speak about. So one is the fact that there's a risk of direct impact to the domestic economy. We're already starting to witness that with businesses being shut down, the supply chain, our strong trade links across Africa, as well as with China, who has been heavily impacted by this. But as a response to all of this crisis, what we have seen is Lagos being in the forefront, very proactive in terms of critical action items, identifying the essential support services, trying to understand what sort of stimulus packages need to happen as well. And this has been unraveling. The gravity and the speed at which Lagos was able to move was actually quite interesting, and we're actually quite grateful for that as a city and as well as citizens of that city. Secondly, the workforce has been heavily impacted by this crisis. We started off with Mr. Governor pushing for a gradual decrease in the number of movements by putting out some small but very impactful interventions. And of course, when we thought in Lagos that we had started our 1 week, we did have Mr. President come through with a full lockdown, which we started experiencing as of Monday. Obviously, this has raised quite a number of concerns for a number of businesses out there. And for us as a firm, for us as EY, it was probably easier than most other firms. For you as government, we can understand the type of challenges that you potentially faced, but we see that you've actually been carrying along in being able to keep the government running, even with some of your critical officers being out of government or from Alausa. In addition, we also see the impact on the economic growth, as well as some of the fiscal policies that you may need to put in place, not just during the crisis, but post the crisis. In some of the later slides, when I'm actually starting to get into the depth of this, I will talk about what some of the other countries have done, what Lagos has done well, areas that you should also potentially focus on, and of course the need for flexibility. Without putting in some sort of flexible work arrangement, we would have had a full shutdown, which would have affected a lot of critical infrastructure, the people, the masses, and making sure that we're building some sort of resilient ecosystem. A few things that we see that are critical are largely around 4 areas that you will need to focus on. And those 4 areas are really key to building a resilient work environment. We've spoken to a number of our clients. We've also spoken to a number of state governments as well as at the federal government level. And the impact, I would say, has been quite tremendous. Sorry, just a second. Lola, could you please move thank you. So there are a couple of things that need to happen. We know that we're all very critical in terms of what do we do relative to moving people forward, getting business going. But the first thing is our people are our greatest assets. What is important is to make sure that we've identified the key set of people that need to keep activities going, whether in our daily place of work, whether it's within the government, whether it's within support services. And then the second is business continuity, because without those individuals, your businesses cannot continue to run. The second is then really around how do we protect that business? How do we encompass it? And that's where we start to talk about business resiliency, business continuity, planning, and even forecasting into the future, all of the key activities that need to happen. The third is then really around building liquidity. And when I talk about liquidity, I mean, sometimes people think, well, this only applies to the corporate environment, but for you as government as well, businesses are shut down. What is the impact to your taxes? What is the impact to the revenue that is coming in? The FAC allocation that is coming to you as a state government, how does that impact other procurement or supply chain activities that need to happen? And of course, the last is how do you engage your stakeholders? For you as a state government, you have a huge stakeholder community that you need to manage. First is the citizens. Second, the other regulators and other subnationals outside of yourself, because you also have some of your regional partners, so other states that have borders with Lagos and may have overflow of either their citizens working here or potentially people residing here, but are actually from other areas. And really not just identifying those stakeholder groups, but what is the key message that needs to happen and how do you enforce that message? We conducted a survey across some of our corporate entities, and we found out that a lot of organizations, even though they had business continuity plans in place, were actually hit and surprised by this. So it was actually about 79% of the population that was affected and the businesses. We reckon that for the states, it is similar. We see that the federal government is actually treading behind the state government, but we see a lot of activities that are happening over the next few days to really get this up and running and stabilize us before we actually move to a full remote environment. I'm going to hand over to Lola, who's really going to talk about the crux of this, to focus on a resilient workforce. What does that mean for the people of Lagos State? What does that mean for the critical functions that you have in place? And how does that affect some of the policies as well as the bureaucracies of government? Lola, please.
Your Excellencies, please permit me to stand on already established protocols. Again, just to extend our gratitude to the hardworking workforce of Lagos State. I think this for me is a proud moment. In times like this, it's good to know that we're thought of and we're looked after. Thank you so much for your efforts today. So, Mr. Honorable Moderator, please, may I ask if at this point you want us to take any reactions to this introduction, or do I have your permission to continue?
I think it will be best to just run through quickly. I would invite participants to just note down their questions so that we don't break the flow. I hope that's okay, Honorable Commissioner Esther.
That's fine, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So in terms of the reality, Lagos State has been in the forefront. Most times, as you would admit, when you're in a battlefront, your welfare is sort of what you put out last. And most times you're focused on making sure everything goes according to plan. However, we see that not just, as Bumi has mentioned, it's not only the private sector that has the need and the urgency to also take care of its welfare. So really, the welfare of its employees. And we see that in light of what has happened to Lagos, there are certain priorities that have now become not just related to private sector, but for the public sector as well. So the shutdown obviously affected the workforce about 70%. That's statistics out there. But there's a requirement now to ensure that, look, how do we ensure that service delivery continues on a digital level? We know that a lot of our hospitals, yes, they're connected, but there's a lot of physical movement of files and even physical presence for work to go on. So these are some of the challenges that we see. Then generally, how do we ensure that productivity remains constant in this era of moving things on a digital platform? Then there's digital engagement and of course digital consultation, but most importantly, the public sector is set up in a particular way. And of course, it's unique to the public sector in terms of the realities that must happen for how work should interact. So generally, it would be important as a state government to look at what are essentially the people priorities around how work should and must continue in these times. And then even moving forward, post-COVID, how do we ensure that the safety of the Lagos State workforce is assured? And then generally, how do we even enable Lagos State workforce to continue to function post-COVID and in the realities we are faced with? I think for us, one or two things is to first look at role communication we play. We've mentioned that generally, a lot of people do not probably have as much hardware as they should have access to, things like computers. A lot of the work still requires physical access. The same way the government has been in the forefront of providing us information, the workforce also needs some assurance or some guarantees around what they would be told or how they should conduct their affairs around these times. Naturally, we also know that the way performance is assessed for public sector employees is probably a bit different from the rest of us in the private sector. So there will also be need for guarantees or assurance how this would go and how do we make sure that the service that we've promised the citizens and the larger society at large continues. So of course, the communication is key. I think it's worthy of note that let's take pioneered the first virtual executive council meeting. And even though interaction on social media was mixed, we can see that generally it did enough or a lot to garner support for the approach that this administration has taken to addressing the issues. So generally we can see that having or leveraging the benefits from using a virtual platform, it is expected that this would be some of the ways in which communication should continue within the workforce. I guess one challenge would be, well, currently a lot of people probably don't have desktops and computers. Fortunately, we have one of the most connected population when it comes to mobile telephones. Within secure purposes, it's also possible to divert or transfer some of the information. However, this would also require some restrictions around what is shareable via those platforms, and that's where the policy comes in. It's also important to use these same communication platforms to sort of talk about the well-being of people. Generally, like I said, because the government is in the forefront of managing crisis, a lot of the communication, a lot of the welfare is towards the citizens. But we also know that public sector is one of the largest employers of labor. So it's important that the same platform is taking care of the welfare of people. What are the assurances they're getting around mental health? All the fear, all the information, who is in the forefront of assuring them that the same way the citizens have been considered, they are also placed on the forefront of that program. Now, most importantly, which is really good in these times, we do not have a choice anymore whether or not to get on board remote working. We have shown that it's possible. 70% of the workforce is at home, but the state is still working. But we know as this stretches, it will put a lot of pressure. So clearly there would be urgency around relooking the policies as to how we govern or what exactly it works. Is it possible that some processes before that we could have moved, that are done by paper, could now be done virtually? I guess in this case, it also means that we need to classify information. So things that were probably classified would need to go through several layers of iteration to determine what is shareable, what remains protected. That is one level. When it comes to productivity, I think, as we say, a lot rests and falls on leadership. Fortunately, we have the good example set by continuing work on a virtual platform. I think it now calls for greater collaboration in terms of how the teams within the state work to begin to encourage a lot more people to continue functioning with meetings. As I said earlier, so they can also get on continuous. I just want to bring out of the challenge, how then do we ensure that the future workforce is ready? I did say that the Lagos State government is one of the largest employers of labor if you look at the count of the civil service population, which also means that we'll be dealing with the realities of having young people come into work and want to make sure we're able to attract top talent. So going beyond COVID, it presents a threat at the same time there's the opportunity to now begin to relook how we have structured work, how we look at performance management. So it's almost like asking that the government goes through attractive to the younger population, which is why I said the engagement that having the first virtual meeting to our advantage. And then, of course, all talk of getting on board remote working, beyond getting the policy in place, which is something we're very good at as government. There is a fact of getting people actually comfortable with using communication technology. We don't have an option as to whether it is we get on board. It is something we would have to deal with as the right way to continue working. So generally, we need to then consider what kind of infrastructure is suitable. Obviously, there are a lot of priorities pressing for funds. So this would not be the time, obviously, to go on a drive of buying computers and machines. We then need to continue to push the agenda or the message that Lagos belongs to all of us. But of course, there will be need to review some policy guidelines around whether or not people can comment or connect with their devices. I had talked about policies around what information is shareable, declassifying some information, reviewing some of the protocols around approvals, but of course, still making sure that everything happens within the limit of what the public sector expects. Then generally the communication framework. Typically, the civil service relies on a hierarchical process, which is good, but it will now mean that we need to encourage more communities of practice around the employees. So the same way in private sector, we say managers should not be responsible for welfare of their staff. Like for example, at EY, we're doing daily check-ins with our teams, even though our leaders are on the forefront. We need to then encourage this culture as a workforce so people take ownership for what exactly is important. Then what we need to have in place as critical success factors. Not all functions as it is can really go into the remote way. And that, for example, is obvious. Some still require paper. Like the judicial system might take a while to get on board, but other processes like land, establishment, and pensions, it's probably easy to quickly get on board the digital approach. The reason why we're doing this is you're building a model of, you're using incremental value to promote the push and the exchange. I mean, again, I keep going back to the first virtual exec exco meeting. Leveraging that becomes a broad statement to communicate how things will go. Yes, disasters can happen, but work could not stop. Then generally, as we're going into having people connect with multiple devices, there would be need to strengthen our cyber security protocols. So really what happens is, because as we know, data is oil, data is priceless. And Lagos, as one of the largest cities in sub-Saharan Africa, obviously is a data warehouse. So it's important to have that in place. Then the ICT training would probably be the big agenda in terms of getting everyone comfortable to begin to use technology as the way of life, as the way forward. I just want to end generally by saying that really when it comes to facing the realities of the future, even though private sector is on board it, as public sector, there really isn't an opportunity to get a pass. Disruption has shown that it can happen, and it will change the way we have been working and will work for time to come. If we're going to be on the strong foot of being able to attract top talent and continue to do so, it's also important that we begin to explore and see how our processes can embrace digital and other ways of working that are applicable for the fourth industrial revolution. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Lola. Just before the next speaker from EY, I just want to remind participants that if you go to the very bottom of your screen, in the middle of the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A tab with which you can post questions on anything that you've heard so far. So please do use that tab, and we will get the questions on the speakers will be able to respond to those questions as soon as we get them. Back to EY.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abba. Moving on to some of the other slides that we'd like to share. So Lola has spent some time really talking about what we need to do from a workforce perspective. How do we protect our workforce? How do we make sure they keep going? I like to look at the holistic piece, which is really talking about strategic resilience. What are the key things that you need to do to really make sure that we get over this hump, which could actually take a while, given some of the forecasts that we're seeing out there. I'd like to take us on a quick journey. I think some of you are familiar with this already, but really to remind us that we've actually just been on this journey over the last 30 days, and some of the responses that the Lagos State government has actually been able to provide in terms of very quick reactions as well as initial activities. So without spending too much time on this, on the 29th was literally when we started having conversations around COVID in Nigeria, given the index case. About 2 weeks later, there was a case in Lagos. And between then and now, it's actually a 2-week period and a full month for Nigeria as a whole. In terms of responses, which the Lagos State has actually been able to provide, we've grouped this into 4 key areas, which we believe are critical. One is largely around communication and sensitization, and this is really important. I actually went out on Monday, which was the day where the actual lockdown was supposed to start. And I saw a significant amount of people still on the road, not in their cars, probably not the likes of you and myself, but a lot of artisans, people in the informal sector, and they were really taking this lightly. They didn't understand this, even though we know that there's a lot of messaging out there to really communicate the impact. But to them, this is really just another issue, or it's like malaria, or it's a rich man's problem. But the state has actually started a significant amount of communication. So we see that LASEMA is going out and running some campaigns in the market today. We also see the likes of LASEPA, who's going out and enforcing that some of these businesses are shut down and actually not pulling in crowds of more than the permissible 20 or 50. So we started with 50 and then we moved down to 20. So the churches that were in violation, the establishments that were in violation. And then moving on, we're also seeing what has happened with the school system. The state government, obviously for the private schools, they're a lot more advanced in terms of the types of technology that they're using. For the public schools, we're seeing what is happening largely around using the radio to continue to engage them. We're also seeing the likes of the DSTVs that are coming on board to dedicate a channel really for learning. Also, there's really information around what is happening. So stakeholder management to really curb the spread, engaging the private sector, speaking to them. There are a couple of emails, I'm sure we're all inundated with emails that have come out either from our service providers or businesses. You're seeing the likes of LCC sending messages around toll and what the protocol will be at the two toll booths that we have in Lagos today. We're also seeing what the banks are saying around messaging as well. So there's a lot that is happening, and the key area is also around prevention and control. So the healthcare system, we're seeing Prof pretty much running around trying to make sure that there are enough test kits out there. There's a collaboration with the state government on the isolation centers. What do you do? What are the protocols? And of course, making sure that the guidelines with the WHO as well as with the NCDC are actually being followed and sustained as well.
Mrs. Kuku, I'm going to have to move you along a bit more, because
Okay.
I think you still have a lot of slides to go through. So
That's fine. So just really quickly, I'm not going to go through all of the slides, but I'm going to talk about 4 key areas that you need to focus on. Lola, if you can move to the prior slide, please. Lola, if you can move back to the prior slide. So again, in terms of the 4 key areas, one is really around supporting the healthcare systems and the hospitals. So making sure that there's enough information for contact tracing, as well as for people to report some of the issues that they're having. Data-driven crisis management. This is where we actually believe that there's a lot of work that needs to happen. So it's not just about knowing that we have 150 plus cases in the country today, but really starting to identify the areas where some of these cases are starting to spring up and starting to provide some sort of buffer or a shield. I understand that Luth today is potentially going out in communities and actually trying to do random testing. As of this morning or yesterday, there was information around the sample size that they're taking, as well as what is really happening. But predictive analysis is what we consider important. We saw that this had helped largely in China. We're also doing this to support a lot of our clients in other countries as well. So the likes of Italy, who's struggling today, Spain, and also some of the other African countries, to really say, where will the potential hotbeds be? What can we do in those areas? What kind of support in terms of either relief are you putting in those areas, or what is actually driving the spread in those areas? We consider that to be very critical. And then making sure that there's some sort of learning. If you look at South Africa today, South Africa is actually directing all of their businesses, where as long as you have a website in South Africa, you must link any information about COVID to the government site so that the messaging is consistent as well. I'll move on to the next one, really to talk around from a policy perspective, as well as looking at from how you support the MDAs of government. Today, we're in what I consider to be phase 3 of what is showing us on the slide, which is global crisis. So we're seeing a loss of the community spread activities happening, the labor supply shortages. There's a huge shock to the market that is happening today. So for those of you that either have some sort of stock or you invest in the capital market, you've seen the shock on all of that. And then we're seeing all of the public events that are canceled, and of course, moving to a virtual environment. So some of those activities are actually still happening, but in terms of the form in which they're happening, they're actually quite different. But the one area that we really need to focus on and think about is the future. So what happens after this? Because there are a lot of activities that are happening in parallel to make sure that we get through this hump. But then what? What do you do around recovery? Some key areas to focus on is the fact that this is going to have a huge impact on our public health system. So what do we do to all of the medical care personnel that we have in place? What do we do with the infrastructure? How do you replenish some of the materials or the supplies that have been used? What are we looking to the small and medium-sized businesses who are the ones that actually sustain our markets today? So taking the likes of the Ministry of Commerce, Ministry of Wealth Creation, all of those guys that are actually relating with all of these small businesses. What are we doing to support them? What sort of interventions, what sort of programs are happening? And then credit shortfalls. This is actually really relevant to the point of, if you look at your sources of revenue, again, back to IGR, back to FAC, what are you doing to make sure that if this continues to persist for the next 2 to 3 months, we've seen what has happened to the oil prices. How do we buffer to make sure that you can continue to pay salaries? You can continue to meet your debt obligations? Do you need to look through some of the activities today to say, look, these are the payments that we have. How do we push that over some of the non-performing loans? And then also to look at widespread aversion. But largely, back to the workforce, how do you then make sure that you have skilled the necessary people to make sure that you can get through the recovery phase? Again, a lot of them have probably not been through a collapse of the system similar to this. So looking at economic preservation, which we consider to be key. So in the healthcare system, what do we do from a business perspective? So looking at the Ministry of Finance, looking at the STO, the debt management office as well. How do we then make sure that that support is actually in place and we're moving the interventions to the right areas? And then of course, you're looking at the consumers and the citizens of the state as well. What is the impact to them? My biggest fear, for example, is what is going to happen to that informal sector, the people that live on a day-to-day basis. What kind of learnings are you making available to them? Who are the people within citizens and the Office of the Citizens Engagement who are supposed to continue to liaise with them? How do we make sure that all of that information is clear? They understand what the next steps and the critical activities that they need to do over the next few days. And of course, the Resiliency Office. Really, this is a major global disaster, but the key is how do we then recover from this? So moving on quickly, Lola. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide, just in the essence of time, because we want to have an opportunity for questions. But I would like to quickly speak to 2 countries that we have seen that have been largely affected and some of the things that they're doing today, which the states may consider, given that Lagos is really at the forefront of the activities happening in Nigeria today. So we've seen Italy, who is one of the worst hit by COVID-19, who have granted some sort of debt payment extensions, obviously through working with the Ministry of Finance. In addition, we've seen things with the utility payment assistance. So utility payments from a water, a gas, and an electric perspective. How do we see if we can defer this or provide some subsidies? We're starting to see that already from a petroleum perspective, but for the utilities that are provided by the state. So things like water, waste management, how do we make sure that this continues to happen? So what's LOMA doing in this area to make sure that we actually don't put ourselves in a situation where there is another health challenge because the waste is not moving? The other things that we're looking at are things around stimulus plans that are in place. There are a lot of donations that are coming in from the private sector. How do we make sure that we prioritize the use? Little things like the informal sector, what is actually going out to them? We see that the Ministry of Agri is actually mining the database of LASRA today to look through some of the vulnerable communities out there. But how do we make sure that they actually have those skills to do the data analysis, to understand these are the populations or the vulnerable sectors of the population that we need to look to? How do we support them? So again, there are critical skill sets that are required at this time that we want to make sure that we provide that necessary support as we're starting to look through some of the critical areas. Singapore as well is looking at things around rent flexibility, some sort of tax rebates, as well as cash payouts to certain sectors that could potentially happen. Just given those key areas, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Oweru, who will pretty much close the session for us, and then we'll take some questions. Benson? Okay, we may be having a challenge with Benson, so I'm just going to continue the session so that we can close out. So what is really critical is the fact that there has to be a collaborative effort and a holistic effort to managing crisis at this time. So one is really around the risk and response assessment. making sure that we're also monitoring the information. So it's one thing to have data, but it's another thing to actually be able to make some critical decisions or some executive decisions based on the data that we're starting to see. So from a workforce perspective, we're looking at what kind of change management activities, making sure that you have some potential champions in place. Lola had mentioned devices. So this is now a bring your device to work kind of environment where you may not be able to scale as quickly in terms of giving all of your officers or all of your admin staff the necessary equipment, but being able to augment what they have in place already. And then there's the crisis operations management itself, where you're really looking at all of the training programs that you need to roll out over the next few days, even basic things such as, you know, the use of basic computer skills, use of certain office or collaborative tools, and then we continue to make sure that we're communicating over time, because, you know, it's not so much as over communication, but making sure that we don't flood people with too much information, but getting the right information and targeted information to them at the right time. Next slide, please. And then really to share the case study on EY Africa. Ben, I don't know if you want to take that quickly or for me to take that. Ben? Okay, so I'll just really wrap up. We'd like to use ourselves as a case study last year around what's, yes, Ben? I will continue in case it's having some communication challenges, just really around what EY has been able to do very quickly over the last 30 days that we've been in. So the first is we activated the remote work very quickly. We did have the tools and technology available to do this. We had some challenges with, obviously in some locations, so areas where they didn't have devices, whether it's, you know, the use of cellular phones or power challenges, but we augmented that by considering other tools such as some of the, you know, in Nigeria specifically, we have, you know, the Luminous tool that is available, even looking at small things like extended battery life or battery packs for some of our employees. Also using, you know, portable car chargers that allow you to charge your laptops. The second is really around the employee health and well-being. What we did do is to try and put in some check-ins from time to time. So on our projects, so if you have critical activities or projects that are going on within the states today, you potentially put in some check-ins in place on a frequent basis so that you know what everyone is working on. There's not that feeling of, you know, things are getting left behind. The third is really around mobility of the workforce. So really right now, there are challenges with people either that were, you know, you have some staff that maybe they were staying on the island because of work and moving back to the mainland, just really making sure that from a mobility perspective, they're in the right place where they can get the right support to get their work done and to be able to build some resilience at this time. Obviously, public safety is critical. We know that the state is looking at that today, but we also found that to be quite important in terms of, you know, the timing of, you know, people getting to either their place of work or even which you can't do at this time, but relatively to being trying to pull the essential services that you need. Cyber is also something to watch out for, given that we're all now connecting to either, you know, the state government server or to some devices using our individual devices. So making sure they're watching out for spam or hacks, and cyber is critical. Of course, things around delegation of authority, I believe the Honorable Commissioner for Staff as well as Lola spoke about this, you know, very quickly to say, look, there are things that we need to do today around, you know, the PS being the chief officer of the ministry, using the filing system, making sure that you still get your approvals and that we're not in any breach, even though that we're trying to do some of these remote work activities right now. And of course, for us, we believe that client focus is very critical. So we establish some of our high priority clients as you are establishing some of your high priority stakeholders and making sure that we're getting the right information across to them in a timely manner. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back over to the moderator in case there are questions that we have available that we can support you with.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Kuku. We have had some questions while the presentations were going on. I'll defer to the Honorable Commissioner for Establishment, Training and Pensions as to whether we should address those questions first or we should open it up for people who may wish to speak?
I think we can address the questions, and then if anybody wants to speak, they can also indicate by raising their hands.
Okay, thank you, Ma. So I'm going to read some of the questions in case everyone cannot see them. And then I would abuse my privilege as a co-presenter and offer some answers to some of them, and others can also, other panelists can also chip in. So Mr. Wasiu Akewusola asked about how we address the issue of power before we can go fully digital. And a related question came from Mr. Sheson Ogundeko. How do we work around internet access and the issue of cyber attack? So let me quickly address those two. Again, just from my experience of having been a Director General in the federal government. Civil servants, public servants will always find a reason why it cannot be done. And that reason is usually, we don't have laptops, you need to give us training, you need to pay for our internet, you need to do all of this, all of that before it can happen. What I actually did was to give all of my staff 1 year to become computer literate, otherwise they were out. I treated computer literacy as a competency requirement for doing the job. So a bit like a hammer that a carpenter must have before they can work. And believe it or not, people got their children to teach them. I didn't have to spend a kobo on internet training. The second thing about internet access and power and hardware is that everybody has a smartphone. In fact, most people have more than one smartphone. The challenge for us is how can we get things into smartphone format. We ran a program in Borno State called Women for Health, where we were able to take the entire curriculum for nursing and put it onto an Android phone that doesn't require internet access. So that way, if a patient is presenting symptoms to a health worker, they can actually go on their phone and get a sense of what those symptoms might be telling them. And that improved diagnosis by more than 70%. It improved the accuracy of diagnosis by more than 70%. So it's possible to do these things despite all of these challenges, is the point that I'm making. Challenges of power, challenges of internet access, challenges of computer hardware, if you actually just apply your minds to it. Do any of the panelists want to weigh in on issues of internet access, power, and hardware before I move on to the next question?
If I may, sir. Hello, sir.
Yes, please, Mrs. Esson, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. So I think, as we mentioned earlier on, that this dealing with this challenge requires a multi-stakeholder approach. Within the civil service, they have very large cooperatives. So I think this is one area where we see opportunity. And there are schemes to allow people to participate in asset acquisition, but there's also the benefit of pushing the message that this is for your own good. Because honestly, dealing with the challenges the state is faced with, it's really not feasible to go on a drive to acquire hardware right now. So we have got to be able to use adaptive communication and change agents within the system to promote people actually investing in what matters. Again, one level to pitch the message is you're doing this sort of safeguarding your future. So, I mean, government obviously cannot take the decision to not pay like the private sector would, because obviously there are rules. But I think there's opportunities to deal with stakeholders that we would not ordinarily have looked at in terms of solving this problem. And I think the cooperatives offer a very good opportunity to do that. Then also making sure that within the change agents, we don't go the regular public sector route of using the senior people to be the purveyors of good news. We should also need to make sure across all levels and all levels, we've got people who are pushing the message of why a better, more efficient digital government is actually better for me as an employee. That would be my contribution, sir.